Sheva selaku partner lamanya dia. Kemudian si Josh juga dari Resident Evil 5 juga sebagai mentornya si Sheva, itu juga menurut gue bisa dia masukin di situ karena sebagai orang yang juga dia kenal. Bahkan Leon pun menurut gue bahkan menurut gue bisa lah dia masuk ke sini. Ya tapi kalau Leon mungkin karena dia masih kerja untuk pemerintah Amerika Serikat, jadi mungkin gue rasa nggak mungkin kalau misalkan Leon minta gitu aja kayak gini. Tapi andai misalkan dia lagi kayak butuh bantuan di luar off the book gitu ya, gue rasa Leon tuh bisa dan cocok gitu buat masuk ke HWS yang benar-benar isinya adalah veteran-veteran semua gitu ya. Satu lagi yang menurut gue cocok adalah si Parker Luciani dari seri Resident Evil Revelations, karena bahkan di manga Resident Evil Heavenly Island pun si Parker juga dibilang oleh Chris sebagai salah satu orang yang dia percaya untuk membantu adiknya sendiri si Claire. Jadi gue rasa dia pun juga sebenarnya bisa cocok masuk ke HWS di sini gitu ya. Nah juga satu lagi adalah Capcom itu juga sering banget ini menampilkan karakter dan tim-tim unik seperti ini tuh hanya di satu adaptasi aja, sehingga ada kemungkinan ya kita itu tuh tidak akan pernah melihat Arnold Squad lagi, sama seperti kita tuh nggak pernah dengar kabar karakter yang contoh si Carlos, si Sheva, Helena, Josh itu kan adalah karakter yang menarik, tapi sampai sekarang pun mereka itu nggak pernah kedengaran kabarnya sama sekali. Nah kemudian kalau misalkan itu kan tadi perbandingan untuk individual ya, kalau misalkan perbandingan dari organisasi ada tuh dari film Resident Evil Vendetta, yaitu Silver Dagger. Itu kan juga merupakan unit elit di bawah BSAA kan, dan bahkan gue juga baca kok banyak sebagian dari kalian yang udah nyangka ini si cewek ini jangan-jangan yang dari kita nih, yang si namanya Nadia itu kan kalau nggak salah kan, ternyata bukan kan, malah si Emily Berkhoff di sini. Kan itu kan sayang banget sebenarnya kalau misalkan si Chris pengen bikin sebuah rogue team ya, dia tuh bisa aja ngambil bahkan dari si Silver Dagger di sini, tapi ya kemungkinan di sini juga karena Chris udah nggak percaya sama BSAA, mungkin dia juga bener-bener cuma bisa percaya beberapa orang aja dan nggak bisa meresikokan yaitu ngasih tahu BSAA tentang apa langkah selanjutnya dia gitu ya. Nah tapi tidak bisa dipungkiri juga ya bahwa meskipun dengan muka yang tertutup dan juga ada mereka pakai masker dan pakai vision juga, masing-masing dari anggota ini tuh benar-benar punya kepribadian yang menurut gue lebih menarik daripada tim Chris Bina yang minus si Pierce sama Sheva mungkin ya, memang benar-benar mereka didevelop dari sebuah dan mereka itu kerasa bukan cuman maksudnya sebagai bawasan si Chris aja gitu ya, karena terbukti dari beberapa obrolan radionya mereka itu mereka kayak punya kepribadian yang benar-benar di-develop gitu sama Capcom gitu ya. Bahkan contoh yang paling besar menurut gue adalah ketika si Chris itu cukup berani dalam mengkritisi keputusan Chris yang dia itu nggak mau ngasih tahu Ethan tentang apa sebenarnya rencana mereka di desa ini dan untuk Ethan dan untuk Rose juga gitu ya. Bahkan beberapa dari mereka juga sepertinya sudah pernah bekerja sama dengan Chris ya jauh sebelum kejadian di Resident Evil Village gitu. HWS ini juga terlihat lebih terlatih dan bahkan lebih efisien dalam pelaksanaan masalah mereka. Sekali lagi terbukti dengan tidak ada sama sekali korban jiwa dalam misi yang mereka jalani kali ini. Tapi mungkin di sini kalian juga bisa bawa argumen, tetap aja bang itu ada timnya yang meninggal, yang bawa Ethan sama Rose di mobil kan itu dibunuh sama Miranda tuh, makanya si mobilnya itu juga bisa kecelakaan. Nah sebenarnya ada indikasi kalau tim yang nyerang rumahnya Ethan ini sebenarnya bukan Homeless Squad ya, itu sebenarnya bukan HWS, itu sebenarnya adalah tim selaan Chris yang lain gitu ya. Nah ketika timnya yang bawa Ethan sama Rose itu kecelakaan, barulah Chris mengerahkan HWS-nya yang akhirnya kita lihat di pertengahan game dan juga di akhir game. Nah harapan gue sih semoga aja si Homeless Squad ini tuh benar-benar bisa dimunculin nanti di Resident Evil 9 atau Resident Evil apapun nanti, yang pokoknya bakal membahas kelanjutan dari korupnya BSAA yang diceritakan di endingnya Resident Evil Village gitu ya. Karena menurut gue sayang aja kalau misalkan si Homeless Squad di sini ini bakal berakhir seperti timnya Chris di Resident Evil Vendetta, itu Silver Dagger. Kelihatannya udah cakep nih, kelihatannya udah ini kayaknya timnya kompeten dan kayaknya mereka juga bisa pada akrab sama si Chris-nya. Ternyata hilang begitu aja dan digantikan dengan HWS. Ya gue tidak komplain karena si HWS ini pun juga merupakan pengganti yang cukup keren. Tapi setidaknya mereka bisa bertahan lebih dari satu game aja, yaitu Resident Evil Village di sini ya. Nah ini aja yang bisa gue ceritakan tentang Homeless Squad. Gue sebenarnya masih berharap mereka itu punya DLC, tapi di sisi saya gue juga ngerti kalau misalkan mereka yang jadi DLC-nya pasti ini game bakal jadi COD beneran gitu ya. Udah gitu kalau misalkan mereka juga pakai first person, udah bener-bener COD banget gitu ya. Jadi langsung aja berkomentar pendapat kalian tentang KWS di sini, pendapat kalian juga tentang review ini gimana? Apakah sehebat itukah juga menurut kalian? Bisa langsung komentar aja, dan juga pendapat kalian apakah mereka juga bakal muncul nanti mungkin di DLC-nya si Rose? Langsung aja ya, bisa kita diskusi bareng-bareng. Nah, sekian untuk video yang bisa gue ceritain kali ini. Gua Pakai Freak signing off, dan thank you banget semuanya. Bye-bye.
Google Fi, a phone plan by Google. Fi has unlimited plans that fit your data usage. Simply
DD, or Different Dimension, is a series of cards with their own specific lore that are mechanically centered around the Banner Zone, which acts as the different dimension these cards refer to. So in this video, we're going to focus on the best cards from a different dimension. Mention that aren't part of the D/D archetypes, how the theme has recently been relevant for years, and why they're so useful. Guiding the way to number 10 is DD Guide, a level 4 Dark Warrior monster whose effects makes them very unassuming at first glance. When it's normal summoned, you must give control of DD Guide to your opponent, and it also has the effect that during the end phase, the opponent of the monster who controls DD Guide must target one card in its controller's graveyard and banish it. Yeah, technically speaking, DD Guide's first and second effects can be used generically as a way to banish the engine pieces from your opponent's graveyard that they'd want to use during their own turn. And being able to banish something like an Elvish Golden Lord is actually very beneficial for hurting their follower. Despite this, however, there's a lot of things which make DD Guide unappealing to most strategies. Most notably, it gives your opponent a free monster which doesn't have any kind of downside like Nightmare Corruptor easily does, essentially giving your opponent a free material for extra summons, or even just an extra body in which to attack and overpay you. However, there is one deck in which DD Guide actually managed to be extremely beneficial because it gave your opponent a monster on their side of the field, Mystic Mine. Mystic Mine is a card that states that if your opponent controls more monsters than you do, they cannot attack or activate effects, with the same happening to you if you control more monsters than your opponent, and if you both control the same number of monsters, Mystic Mine would destroy itself during the end phase. For a long while, this specific clause was a problem for Mystic Mine decks, as it meant they would struggle if their opponent refused to commit a monster to their field, or if those Mystic Mine decks had to go first, because if both you and your opponent didn't control a monster, Mine would destroy itself, leaving you wide open to being OTK. And one of the ways in which Mystic Mine deck would start to prevent this is with DD Guide. By normal summoning Guide, its effect would activate to give control of itself to your opponent, and then you can activate Mystic Mine to lock him out of monster effects entirely, and because they control a monster, Mine would destroy itself. In fact, because of the way Mine decks are built, it's unlikely that you'd ever control a monster on your side of the field. So if your opponent didn't have any kind of spell or trap card removal in their deck, they'd essentially be locked out of the game entirely on their first turn. However, despite how good this combo is, DD Guide only makes it to number 10 spot, partially because the effect is only really good in one specific strategy that isn't really a meta contender. And the other is that there are other cards available to Mystic Mine to help them go first. Field Barrier, Demise of the Land, and Metaverse are all capable of either protecting Mine, or allowing it to be activated in your turn after they commit a monster on their side of the field. Even in terms of monsters to give control to your opponent, DD Guide has been outclassed in card prep by Silent Lobby, which instead of needing to activate on its normal summon, can simply be spell to summon directly to your opponent's field, and thereby playing around common staples like Infinite Impermanence or Factory. Still, DD Guide earns the number 10 spot for how it helped boost Mystic Mine in its early days as a strategy, and how effective it was in its specific niche, even if it's not very good anywhere else. And speaking of cards that fill a very specific niche, making our way as an explosive entrance to number 9 is DD Dynamite, a normal trap card that you will no doubt be familiar with if you played Master Duel. Yet, despite being so infamous, DD Dynamite has the relatively simple effect of inflicting 300 damage to your opponent for every one of their cards it damage. In the TCG, DD Dynamite hasn't really done anything too notable other than occasionally pop up in burn strategies like Chain Burn, or more modernly in Trickstar as a tech choice to deal large amounts of burn damage to your opponent as a result of Trickstar's inclination to damage their hand. But in Master Duel, DD Dynamite was actually the centerpiece of an FTK, which was so prominent that DD Dynamite was eventually centered into the game's ban list. You see, usually FTK with DD Dynamite is actually very difficult, as even if you use something like the aforementioned Reincarnation to dash 5 cards away from its hand, 3 DD Dynamites would be equivalent to only 4,500 points of damage, well off the 8,000 life point threshold you need to FPK your opponent. However, what these FPK decks would do is pair DD Dynamite with Banquet of Millions, Lilith, Lady of Lament, and Trap Tricks. Banquet of Millions is a card which allows you to banish your opponent's entire extra deck on turn, if you choose to banish your entire extra deck face down permanently. While Trap Trick and Lilith act as extra copies of both Banquet and DD Dynamite to ensure maximum consistency. So, if you choose to banish 15 cards from your extra deck, your opponent would then need to banish 15 cards from their extra deck, which means that a single DD Dynamite could be used to deal 4,500 points of damage to your opponent. And because your deck would essentially have 9 copies of DD Dynamite when you factor Lilith and Trap Trick, you were virtually guaranteed to see 2 copies of them FPK your opponent during the draw phase by dealing 9,000 points of damage. Eventually becoming so notable that in order to prevent being FPK'd, other decks would opt to run only a 13 card extra deck, so that when their opponent activates Banquet of Millions, only 13 cards would be banished, meaning they'd only take 7,800 points of damage from 2 DD Dynamites. Soon enough though, DD Dynamite was eventually setting on the field, preventing it from being able to be used alongside Lilith and Trap Tricks to consistently FPK your opponent. Currently, the FPK is still technically legal, but you'd have to hard draw those 2 copies of DD Dynamite, making it far less of a threat. But for what it is, DD Dynamite was a notable part of the history of Master Duel, and the FPK is actually fairly consistent in other than the TCG, although it's unlikely to be top in tournaments anytime soon, which is why it makes it on the 9-spot this list. And at number 8, we have DD Survivor, another Dark Warrior monster with an impressive 1,800 attack and 200 defense. It has the effect that, on a sort of hard once per turn, during the end phase, if DD Survivor is banished this turn while it's face up on your side of the field, you must special summon DD Survivor from the banish zone, allowing for it to be constantly recurred during the end phase of each remove from the field. And in past formats, this level of recursion was actually very hard for most decks to keep up with. Treeborn Frog, for example, was a similar card to DD Survivor that was constantly capable of summoning itself every turn during the standby phase, and was so strong it helped form the backbone of Frog Monarch, a deck which used Treeborn Frog and Ronin Totem to keep tribute summoning out Monarch monsters every turn and gain access to their tribute summon effects for free, because you would always get your Treeborn Frog back every standby phase. Likewise, the DD Survivor's recursion also allowed it to act as the star of the show with competitive anti-meta strategies that utilize Macrocosmos. With Macrocosmos, you could summon out a Helios the Primordial Sun from your hand or deck, but the important part is that it was on the field, every card that would be sent to the graveyard would get damaged instead. So, you could use Macrocosmos in order to floodgate your opponent into being able to send cards to the graveyard to either activate an effect like Brotherhood of the Fire-Faced Gorilla, which would otherwise pop Macrocosmos, or prevent them from setting up their own graveyard by dark monsters to summon out something like Blockbuster Soldier and Warrior of the Beginning. But for as powerful as Macrocosmos is in floodgating your opponent out of the graveyard, it doesn't necessarily win the game on its own, which is why DD Survivor comes in, as when it would be destroyed or sent to the graveyard under Macrocosmos, DD Survivor would instead be banished, which means during the end phase, you get to trigger its effective spell to summon itself back to the field, essentially meaning you've lost no advantage. You could use this defensively in order to constantly have an 1,800 attack beat stick to protect your life points from your opponent's boss monsters, or you could use DD Survivor proactively in order to set up your own board for tribute summons of cards like Palace the Shadow Monarch for free in the exact same fashion as Treeborn Frog. Nowadays, while Macrocosmos is still a good card and strong to be limited to